Friends, today is a very special day for two reasons. The first reason, which is obviously the one that springs to your mind immediately, is the fact that today is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Organization, a body which has never been needed more and never talked about less by the ordinary people of most countries in the world, notwithstanding the fact that had we listened to the World Health Organization right from the start, we would have had a far more pleasant pandemic than we have had. Why is it the 75th anniversary? Because the General Assembly opened for the first time on the 24th of October 1945 at Central Hall, Westminster. Of course, they hadn't built the place in New York then. And those of you who are Baha'i history buffs will remember or be interested to know that when he visited California in 1912, Abdul-Baha, the son of the Prophet founder of the faith, Baha'u'llah, made a speech in Sacramento on October the 26th, 1912, and he said, "May the first flag of international peace be upraised in this state." And the UNO was established by the Treaty of San Francisco in September 1945, but the UN's opening is dated to October 24th, 1945, the opening of the first General Assembly. That's the first reason today is special. The second reason today is special is that we have a wonderful and very interesting speaker for you. You can realize how old I am in that he doesn't look particularly young, and yet I've known him since he was really tiny. He's eminently suited to talk about what he's going to talk about today. He took a BA in International Relations and Computer Science from the University of Kiel, an MA in the Chinese business world at SOAS, a postgraduate diploma in software engineering, and then a Ph.D. in communications technology at the University of Hawaii. In this short life, he has also lived in China for some years, in the United States, and in Mexico. He is going to talk to us about thank God for science. One of the important things about the Baha'i view of science is that we view religious truth and objective scientific truth as being two sides of the same coin. Over to you, Ash.
Okay, so as Steve mentioned, thank you for that kind introduction, Steve. And as Steve mentioned, I lived in Hawaii for a period of time, and in Hawaii, a way to greet everybody is to say aloha. So aloha means peace, means love, means joy. So aloha, everybody. Thank you so much to the OZ Whitehead team for this invitation to share some thoughts on this topic of the harmony, really a talk about the harmony between science and religion, and some of my own experiences in which, you know, I've seen and been engaged in research that sort of that I've seen this harmony between science and religion. Just to contextualize before I get into I've got some PowerPoints and some slides, and before I get into sort of talking about the subject directly, just some background sort of context. In the Baha'i faith, the Baha'i community, in the Baha'i writings, we understand this idea, and there's a description of this idea of progressive revelation, how throughout history, messengers of God have appeared to give guidance to and teachings to mankind, to allow for social progress as well as individual laws for individual well-being as well. And so at each stage of history, we've had, you know, and Baha'is believe in all the major world religions, in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, in Zoroastrianism, in Hinduism, in Buddhism. All of these, the Baha'i community recognizes as messengers from the same God and teachings from the same God. And the metaphor is really this idea that the Baha'i, the religion is like, each religion is like chapters of the same book, in which increasingly more that the teachings have built on one another and helped mankind progress and advance socially and individually and so on. And so at each stage of this process of progressive revelation, with these teachings, there's been an impetus in the creative energies and forces in which, you know, that have come about for mankind. And so, you know, with the advent of each of the world religions, we've seen social progress in terms of the movement from the village to the city state to the nation state to now in the Baha'i dispensation, we understand that there's an increasing understanding of the unity of mankind and the oneness of mankind as a global global body, and some teachings associated with that, including, you know, the abolition of prejudices of all forms, the equality of men and women, and these ideas. And then alongside that process, and I think really, you know, alongside the abolition of prejudices of all forms and so on, is this idea of the harmony between science and religion. And we've seen throughout historical, you know, throughout history, that with the advent of a new dispensation, there's been great scientific progress with every religion, in the energies that have been released into society. And so this talk is really, so on the one hand, how I, you know, from my understanding, is that how the Baha'i community now we have the teachings that are for everybody, you know, these teachings of equality of men and women and harmony between science and religion. These are not things that are exclusive to, you know, the understanding which is increasingly being developed on these topics. We see that these ideas, the United Nations, as Steve mentioned, with its 75th anniversary now, you know, this idea of one world in that context, the recognition for, in most parts of the world, whether that's applied or not, you know, the idea of, and that has gained, you know, mass acceptance is, you know, that prejudice is harmful, that equality of men and women is a good thing, that, you know, education is a right for all, is important and necessary, that these have been accepted. And so the presentation that I'm sharing is, on the one hand, that these ideas of global acceptance, but so the presentation is really how using as an example of how I've applied the Baha'i teachings in my research as a case study, as well as so just to summarize that sort of opening sort of context, is that these ideas and this spiritual impetus is part of a progressive force in the whole of humanity, and really this presentation is about the direct Baha'i community teachings in case study of a specific, you know, Baha'i inspired, I would say maybe not Baha'i inspired, but a scientific study that draws directly from the Baha'i principles and Baha'i teachings. So the title of the presentation is "Thank God for Science," and so, you know, with this context that I've already shared, if anyone wants to contact me about any of the ideas that have been shared here, then feel free to email me. That's my email address there. So I'm going to kick off with a quote, and the quote is really a quote from Baha'i.org. Actually, I thought this was a good quote to use.
Harmony of science and religion is one of the fundamental principles of the Baha'i faith, which teaches that religion without science soon degenerates into superstition and fanaticism, while science without religion becomes merely the instrument of crude materialism. Religion, according to the Baha'i writings, is the outer expression of the divine reality. Therefore, it must be living, vitalized, moving, and progressive. Science is the first emanation from God toward man. All created things embody the potentiality of material perfection. But the power of intellectual investigation and scientific acquisition is a higher virtue specialized to man alone. Other beings and organisms are deprived of this potentiality and attainment.
Okay, so just starting off with that sort of that principle, as I've already mentioned, and really the role of science in the Baha'i faith, and the importance of science and the harmony of science and religion, really as described in this, in which, you know, science without religion is materialism, but in the same way, religion without science is superstition, and can be seen as superstition and fanaticism. So really, this kind of moderating influence of understanding this essential harmony between science and religion. The format of how I'm going to sort of present this case study of my own experience in using religious principles in my scientific study, in my social science study, is I'm going to give a little bit of a background of some of the sort of the ideas that sort of drive this. Then I'm going to use my scientific my PhD dissertation in particular, my research in my PhD, as a case study and as an example of how this scientific discourse has the contributions towards the scientific discourse, as well as how, you know, some of my findings and so on that were faith-based findings. Then I've got a short video, and then I've got some reflection questions, which will lead into Q&A. We won't take any discussion in the reflection, but there's some questions that I want to pose that we can maybe lead to, you know, connecting it with a Q&A at the end, which kindly Steve will facilitate. So really thinking about the background. So I've mentioned progressive revelation, that, you know, there's this social evolution, and that you know, each religion has come at different stages of humankind's history to give spiritual teachings that have promoted the social progress of mankind in all its affairs, in its science, in its governance, in its arts, and so on. There is a idea that I think is in contemporary society, in which Michael Karlberg talks about, and he's a professor at Western Washington University. And there's this idea that has become sort of embedded in the assumptions in which we operate in the world in a lot of ways. And then there's this idea that somehow social progress happens or takes place through competition, that when individuals compete against each other, whether in the school system, where we have, you know, competition in exams, whether it's in economics, where you have organized companies that compete against each other, whether it's in politics, where you have parties or, you know, groups of people who compete with each other for power, that somehow that's become a dominant paradigm in many parts of the world for defining how social progress takes place. Michael Karlberg argues the opposite, that it's collaboration by which social progress takes place. He argues that when we think of things in a collaborative sense, where people work together to address solutions to community issues, where groups work together to promote economic development, when in schools there's more emotional quotient, you know, as this current phrase that's being thrown, you know, the emotional quotient, that people who are able to work better with other people are, you know, progress more. He argues that social progress takes place not through competition, but through collaboration and cooperation. And so when we think about this, you know, how that applies in terms of social progress and social evolution, we see that, you know, we see that sort of as almost as a truism in social progress, that social progress has taken place with the evolution of the city-state, the nation-state, and now increasing regionalization with the European Union, with with the African Union, with these different regional organizations, and very appropriately today being the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, increasing global integration that allows for cooperation amongst people. And that's the same for science. We see that my good friend in Hawaii, who serves as a member of the Board of Counselors in Hawaii, Ui Pimental, she was talking about the fact that oftentimes we see in communities where you have universities. Universities are major drivers of social and economic growth. It's where new innovations come out from. It's where people get skills training and knowledge acquisition and all of these processes in the university. And so, we see that this process of collaboration in a university context is an important process. And in the area that I teach in San Francisco Bay Area, we can see one of the big driving factors of social progress in the Bay Area is that it has universities like San Francisco State, Cal State, the places where I teach, and then Stanford, Berkeley, University of San Francisco, many universities in that area. And I think it would be safe to argue that that social progress in that region, the Silicon Valley and a lot of the tech sector and the innovations that come out from the tech sector in Silicon Valley are driven by the innovations that come out from universities. So then we see this harmony between, in the one hand, from the religious perspective, that the evolution of mankind and its increased integration and recognition of the oneness of mankind, and then the scientific setting with universities that bring people from all different parts of the world, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, gender, increasingly so, to then work on these complex social problems that beset humanity. And then from the Baha'i perspective as well, we see that one of the things that I think is a characteristic of the Baha'i community is that embedded in all of the activities that Baha'is undertake is this worldwide perspective, from the Baha'i World News Service announcements to the videos that are published, that are produced, to the study circles that Baha'is are engaged in. All of these things, I think it's kind of, I think we oftentimes don't think about this, but embedded in the pedagogy that is part of the Baha'i study circles that many Baha'is are engaged with understanding the Baha'i writings and engaging in service and so on, is a global identity, is an identity where you have, stories of someone from a village in Africa, where you have someone from a village, or names and stories that are stories from a worldwide perspective. And so it's not just a sort of a kind of pipe dream kind of idea of this global identity. These embedded in the pedagogies of the study circles that Baha'is are engaged in, embedded in the communications and the publications of the Baha'i community, and as well as a fundamental principle, is this idea of a worldwide community and a worldwide identity. So this is just sort of some ideas about the conceptual framework and sort of idea of this case study that I'm presenting. And just as a personal note, as Steve mentioned, I've lived in China. I was born and raised in the UK. So it's such a pleasure to be talking to many folks in the UK as well. As well as spent doing my PhD in Hawaii, teaching in the California area. My wife is from Mexico, and we're Mexico based as well. That part of the sort of the in the identity of the Baha'i community is really, when I lived in China, there were Chinese Baha'is. When I lived in Hawaii, there were Hawaiian Baha'is that were from the diverse Hawaii. In the UK, we had the English, the British Baha'i community, and the diversity that is part of the British Baha'i community as well. In the US, in San Francisco, definitely, the diversity of the San Francisco Bay Area as well. So, it's really this community that is representative of all of the different constituent elements: nationality, class, tribe, all of these things that make up the constituent Baha'i community. So anyway, this is my kind of 3 points. One is a sort of background ideas. One is that we're moving beyond competition and recognizing that collaboration is a form for the social progress. Secondly, that that the social progress happens with progressive revelation, that happens historically, that social evolution takes place with the advent of new teachings that help this social progress. And then finally, the Baha'i community as a community, a worldwide community in action, in thought and discourse, which is made up of every part of the human community. And just one final idea on this global identity. While I was living in Hawaii, I served on the national administrative body, the National Spiritual Assembly of Hawaii, and so I was able to go to International Convention, which is the election of the supreme governing body of the Baha'i community in Israel. And so it was part of this election process, and I was a national delegate to this international election process in Israel. And it was the thing that I think one of the key elements of my experience going to Israel for that was really that all of the national delegates from every part of humanity, from every different part of the world, and I think one of the delegates commented that this was the one of the first times, one of the delegates that had been there many times, that this was the start of really the national delegates being made up of people who are from that place, that people who are from Fiji, from Colombia, that it was increasingly and now representative of the cross section of humanity. So this is my my background in in the scientific discourse. We would talk about it as a theoretical framework. Some more background. The harmony of science and religion. We think about there's an idea which is part of research methods, is this idea of critical realism, that sometimes we think about the underlying causes and values. And there are specific research methods when we do scientific study that highlight spiritual and social justice principles. Critical realism is one of those. Research methods that include indigenous voices, that highlight indigenous voices, that move away from that slightly hegemonic and oftentimes, and I'm not a Western basher kind of person, but that have that bias in the type of research that is valued in academia. We're moving to decolonize. I think that the way we describe it is decolonizing the mind and decolonizing the way that academic research is carried out. Some of these research methods are important research methods: social justice research, and also research that highlights voice, that highlights the voice of those that maybe have been marginalized and not included in academic discourses or and so on. And so these type of research methods lend themselves oftentimes to the kind of research that values social justice and so on. So then Okay, so that's my background. If, you know, those that are familiar with academic research and so on, that sort of, you know, oftentimes in research studies we have, you know, this kind of format as well, that has, you know, that introduction, then literature review and background and conceptual framework, and then, you know, the content, and the analysis and the data. So really this. So based on that sort of contextual framework and that background, what I want to do at this point is really then talk about how I utilized faith-based principles in my own PhD dissertation, as an example of how faith-based principles can be utilized in social science research. So my dissertation was about called Gender Praxis, Rural Fiji Radio and Mobile Devices. To put it in a nutshell, I did a study about how women in Fiji, women leaders in Fiji, use mobile devices to interact with community radio for the purpose of enhancing women's participation in governance structures and resiliency to extreme weather conditions. So I was looking, there's a radio station in Fiji, which is a women-run radio station in Fiji. In Fiji, they have probably some of the world's lowest rates of female participation, women's participation in governance structures, according to a number of studies. So this radio station and some of the activities that go alongside this radio station, I did a study of this radio station and how mobile devices were used with the radio station. I'll talk about my findings in a little while. And in particular to address the imbalance of women's participation in governance structures. So why did I want to do that? Why was that something that, you know, in the assumptions and the values that go alongside why it is that women should be included or not included, but why women should define governance structures, right? So then this was one quote that sort of helped me understand this in the context of another part of my study, which was also climate change, because the Pacific region is also affected quite severely by climate change conditions. So Pete, would you be able to read those paragraphs, please?
Certainly. From the Baha'i International Community, Gender Equality and Rural Development and Social and Economic Development. Around the world, women are largely responsible for securing food, water, and energy for cooking and heating. Scarcity of resources arising from climate change intensifies the women's burden and leaves less time to earn an income, attend school, or care for the family. Moreover, natural disasters exact a heavier toll on women given their lack of access to information and resources, and in some cases, their inability to swim, drive, or even leave the house alone. It would be a mistake, however, to cast women as the victims or simply as under-resourced members of society. They represent perhaps the greatest source of untapped potential in the global effort to overcome the challenges of climate change. Their responsibilities in families, in communities, as farmers and as stewards of natural resources make them uniquely positioned to develop strategies for adapting to changing environmental conditions. Women's distinct knowledge and needs complement those of men and must be duly considered in all arenas of community decision-making. It is in relationship and consultation with one another that the most effective strategies for mitigation and adaptation can be devised. In light of this reality, the United Nations must give more attention to the gender dimensions of climate change. Neither the principal, legal, nor scientific framework guiding climate change negotiations, the UNFCCC, and the synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes reference to gender. To begin to remedy this situation, We call on the United Nations and member states to include a gender dimension to their response to climate change and in their ongoing and future negotiations of climate change agreements.
So it was really reading this, and I knew the principle of equality of men and women, and this had been part of being growing up in the Baha'i community and being part of the Baha'i community, this idea. But really, it was these kind of writings from the Baha'i international community, from other ideas that were shared by the Baha'i international community along these same lines, that really was a very major impetus to what eventually became my PhD research and my social science research. I hadn't thought about this. This was a really interesting idea that, and I think we see that increasingly now. And it was something that I think in places like the Pacific, in the Pacific region, there are networks of women across the Pacific Islands that really work with each other to not only to address climate change, but also to highlight their voices for peace and define what peace looks like. So really these ideas from the Baha'i international community and other writings like this really were sort of ideas that contributed towards my study. And so the study itself, I did a 3-phase study with a pilot. I did interviews with the radio station staff, women leader focus groups, and so on. There was a couple of research questions. I won't get into details of that, but really looking at how the community radio was used for enhancing women's participation and voice and alternative development paradigms. And then the second research question was really that picture at the bottom is when in 2016, Tropical Cyclone Winston hit, which was the strongest tropical cyclone ever to make landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. It caused massive amounts of damage. And this happened halfway through my study. And so my PhD committee, they said, you know what, you've got to talk about this and adjust your study to include how women's voices were being used to address this climate change condition that took place in Fiji. So that's a picture of that, and my study was, evolved to including looking at that based on also some of the quotes like the Baha'i International Community quote. And then this is just a picture of one of the the correspondents who was going out to interview some of the women leaders on some of the issues and so on in their communities. So really this, let me see, have I got another slide? Yeah. And then I found out, I won't go into too much detail about what I found out, but some of the things I found out were the fact that there are mutual support processes. There's a systematic process of enhancing women's voice by speaking in government meetings, by talking on a platform called Mobile Suitcase Radio, all of these different things. And I did this in 3 trips to Fiji, 2 weeks each time. And it was, I have a lot of affection for the Fiji Fiji communities and the people that supported me and that worked with me, and it was just such a blessing to be able to learn in this study. And how does that, so connecting that back with the way in which the Baha'i community then facilitated some of these things, or was that was engaged in some of these things. So firstly, when I did my study, I had friends in Hawaii who were from Fiji. They introduced me to other people in Fiji and folks in Fiji. That meant that this picture is I think the Nowruz gathering in Fiji in 1 year that I went. So this was not so much a study like a study that you might have someone who's an outsider, who's not Pacific Islander, who goes to a place and does a study on as kind of this kind of old way of doing research of this outsider that does this study. But I really made, I have friends in the Fiji community. I went to Fiji activities. I, spent time with friends in Fiji. So really that process kind of made it less problematic in its kind of, in the positionality in which I took as a person doing a study in Fiji who is not from Fiji. So really that friends network that developed in the Baha'i community from the worldwide Baha'i community. My cultural liaison and interpreter, she was a Baha'i from Fiji who's the Secretary General of the Council of Fijian Youth or something like some organization like that. But also, doing this kind of research, I had as a Baha'i who's part of a worldwide Baha'i community, I had an inside. I don't want to say an inside perspective, but that created a point of trust between me, a man, firstly going and meeting with women leaders and talking about women's voice and so on, but also building that trust with the group of people that I was part of, because I was also as a Baha'i, the Fijian Baha'is are part of my Baha'i family. It's there's some of the things that it took away from that sort of insider outsider dynamics as well. So these things assisted, and another process which was contributory towards the development of my studies were the Association for Baha'i Studies North America. In the 2 years leading up to completing my PhD, I presented at the Association for Baha'i Studies conference. I was part of a working group that met monthly. We met via Zoom or Skype. We met via Skype to discuss what we were each working on. It was the Technology and Society Working Group. So these things contributed towards my paradigmatic process of understanding the issues and having a group of people that supported each other in this process of doing scientific research, as well as many people who were part of professional field of technology and so on as well. So this kind of mutual support, which is oftentimes spoken about in the Baha'i community, this is a very direct, as well as being introduced to people in Fiji and so on, this is an important principle of this idea of mutual support, which was facilitated by the Association for Baha'i Studies in this way as well. So that is pretty much the main content of what I wanted to talk about on how there's this kind of mutual support and how science really, the principles between of faith-based principles really have contributed in my study, and this is an example to social sciences or sciences in general. There's this idea in research methods in science that oftentimes ignores the underlying assumptions and values which are embedded in constructs that are part of scientific research. And science is not value-free. Science has values and assumptions that are embedded in science, whether positively or negatively, that influence how science evolves. Science is not, this unsubjective, objective kind of, and Bruno Latour wrote a great article in the New York Times, which talked about the relativity of science. And so when we have these values, which are based on a worldwide faith community's set of values, then that has some, for want of a better word, validity to the way in which that science is carried out. And that's not to say that, folks that don't get their inspiration from the Baha'i writings don't have validity. Obviously, that's not true. But this is just an example of how I was able to take these faith-based principles and apply it in my own personal experience. So just as a final thing that I wanted to share, this is just a video of the topic of my research, which is based on the equality of men and women and equal participation and so on, that shows what I was doing my research on. And this isn't a Baha'i organization. this is Sharon Bagwan Rolls. She founded this women's weather, Femlink Pacific, which was the community media organization. And they were very generous in working with me. And this is just an example of, you know, how they were addressing gender equality in Fiji. So I'm just going to play a couple of minutes of this.
Here are the women. And the women in this episode that you'll get to meet are Regina Rakadikadi. Hi, Regina.
Hello, Sharon.
Regina is a correspondent with Femlink Pacific. You assist us in convening our Women's Leaders Network meetings here in the Central Division. We're also joined by Amra Wati. Hi, Amra.
Fine.
You're well? Good. Now, 90% of the market vendors in Lambasa are women. Is that right? And you are a member of the Market Vendors Association. You're the vice president?
No, I'm the committee member.
You're a committee member of the Market Vendors Association. We have Nanise Vakauni Tambo, the Songasonga Vakamarama Itoke no Sori, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Nanise, about the amazing work you're doing in mobilizing, not just for the No Sori village, but also for the Tailevu. You're doing some amazing work, yes?
Yes.
Great. And last but not least, joining us from the Koronombu Women's Fellowship in Ba, we have Vani Tavuki. How are you, Vani?
I'm fine, thank you, Sharon.
Okay, as we make this program, our country is in recovery mode. We're going through, obviously, social, economic rehabilitation, but we're also looking at the devastating impact of Tropical Cyclone Winston. And through our Women's Weather Watch program, we've been talking to you and other women across Fiji about just what has happened. What have we learned? What have we experienced? Not just in 2016, but if we look back at the impact of many cyclones, floods that we've gone through. But Vani, let's talk about Tropical Cyclone Winston. Koronumbu is a distance away from Ba town. You don't have, the roads aren't fully tar sealed. So what happened in your community that weekend?
It was a devastating event that took place. The wind was very intensive, and compared to the floods, the last floods and cyclones that we have, this is one of the most devastating ones.
Were you following, tracking the weather reports? Were you able to understand when Winston, you know, we initially were told it was going to head towards the Central Division, but by Saturday we were suddenly told it's shifting and it's coming around towards your area. Did you know about that, and how did you prepare?
Yes, Sharon. I was actually in Suva that weekend. I was in Suva and hearing about the intensity of the cyclone, and it was Category 5 cyclone.
To put sort of faces to what it was that I was investigating, and the women's radio station and the women's community media organization that I was researching, and you know, trying to just explore this idea of gender equality in understand gender equality in Fiji, and sort of implement some of these ideas of gender equality and so on. So that's pretty much all I have, and I just wanted to wrap up with one sort of question for thought. So I was looking at, as part of the study that I did there, one of the things that I was also interested in is looking at women's, Fijian women's perspectives on what development looks like and what peace looks like. So I was trying to understand, and it was part of the study that I did. I was looking at post-development theory and these different theories. And in the Baha'i community, oftentimes, you know, this idea of what development looks like looks very different to the sort of the materialist view of what development looks like. You know, that's not to say roads and schools and things like that and hospitals and so on aren't important. Those things are important, but there's a general kind of discourse that have taken place, which is a very it's a power discourse of hegemonic sort of colonial, neo-colonialist ideas, in which you know, the so-called developed countries define what development looks like for the developing countries, right? It's a very loaded way of describing things that means that oftentimes the developed countries have been able to take over the natural resources and use and exploit the natural resources and human resources of the so-called developing world. And so I was interested in this, and in the Baha'i community often, you know, that's reconceptualized, right? Which we see that that we don't see the material progress is important, and it's, you know, it's social and economic development, but really recognizing the spiritual nature and dimension of development as well, and how we define ourselves as spiritual beings, not just consumers and producers, but as spiritual beings that are developing our spiritual capacities and values and qualities and attributes in our lives, and that being sort of a key element of our lives as well. So thinking about that, and you know, there's a great Baha'i World News Service story that that talks about one village in Africa that defines singing as being the way they wanted to see their community progress. They wanted to see singing more in their community, and that's how they define the development in their community. So in this study in Fiji, I was also interested in what development looks like in a Fijian context. So my kind of question that I'm going to leave there, if we want to think about it or not, is how do you define development for your community? What's one principle that guides your perspective of how you define, it's the same question, kind of reworded, perspective of how you define development for your community. So what are some things that you think development goals for your community, however you define that? And that is it. And I'll hand back over to Steve. Thank you all so much for listening. Again, it's such a pleasure to be able to speak with so many folks from the UK. I don't get to visit as much as I'd like to, and it's great to see old friends and faces as well. So thanks, everybody, and I'll hand back over to Steve.
Okay, thank you very much, Ash. Even though I'd actually read your thesis a couple of years back, only when I saw that video did it occur to me that actually broadcasting and the use of the telephone actually helps to mitigate some of the problems of lack of mobility which women suffer from, particularly within a relatively poor country, which is an archipelago, where probably they don't even get the chance very often to go visit the city, the capital, Suva, is it? And yet here we are broadcasting, and telephones give women a voice which they did not otherwise have.